They are said to come from ancient places, from regions marked by older civilizations, from sites left behind. And yet, their beginnings are never entirely clear. Accounts differ. Details shift. What remains is the object itself. A human skull, rendered in quartz. Clear, solid, unchanging. The same form appearing again and again. Recognizable, deliberate, described as though it belongs to something older, something preserved, something left behind. Surrounded by history, but not always by certainty. Only the object remains, and the suggestion that it has come from somewhere distant. Not always in place, but in time. And with so little agreed about where it begins, the question remains: what are we really looking at? They are often placed within the ancient world, alongside civilizations already surrounded by distance and mystery. The Maya, the Aztecs, names that gather around the skulls and begin to shape how they are seen. With those names, other ideas follow. Temples, ceremony, sacred meaning. A world in which objects were not always separate from belief. Within that setting, the skulls begin to feel less like isolated forms and more like relics. Not because their origins have been settled, but because the atmosphere of the ancient world settles around them. Its monuments, its symbols, its silence. Its surviving forms still visible, but no longer fully understood. Set against that distance, the skulls begin to absorb it. Not just age, but significance. Not just history, but the suggestion of something once known and no longer clear. They are spoken of as though they belong to a world shaped by ritual and order. A world in which form was never only form. And because of that, the skulls are rarely treated as objects alone. They are described as though they carry more than their shape, more than their material, something preserved, something left behind, something whose meaning has not remained intact. And so the skulls become tied to cultures that can still be named, even if the objects themselves remain uncertain. Not fixed there by proof, but by association, by repetition, by the sense that they belong to an older world, still capable of holding its mystery. But for some, the skulls belong to something older still. Not to civilizations that survive in record, but to ones believed to have disappeared before it. Lost worlds, forgotten knowledge, cultures remembered less through evidence than through myth. And among those names, one returns often: Atlantis. a lost civilization said to have possessed great knowledge and power, and then vanished beneath the sea. Within that version of the story, the skulls are no longer seen as relics of the ancient world, but as remnants of something deeper, a past removed from ordinary history, a world no longer reached except through legend. That is where the idea shifts. Away from temples that can be named, away from civilizations that can still be traced, and towards a world imagined only in outline. A civilization believed to have existed before the histories that survived it. Advanced, ordered, and then gone. Its knowledge dispersed. Its meaning surviving only in fragments, in story, in whatever is believed to have endured. Within that framework, the skulls are treated not simply as objects, but as traces, not tied to what is known, but to what remains beyond it. And because that world cannot be reached directly, the skulls remain open to it, able to carry whatever has been lost, whatever has been imagined, and whatever is still believed to lie beyond the edge of history. And over time, the story gathers more around them. The skulls are no longer seen as only remnants of a vanished world, but as objects that may belong to one another. From there, the mythology becomes more precise.
The Aztecs are renowned for being somewhat obsessed with death. They're also renowned for being obsessed with the sun. And I think if you had one of these things and you used it in ceremony, you held it up to the sun, these things would light up. They would reflect the sunlight in ways that I think the onlookers would find amazing. I think nowadays there's been a real resurgence with the New Age movement and things like that, that says that maybe these things, because they are quartz, maybe if you got enough of them together, somehow they would exchange information or light up or, do something bizarre.
The skulls are no longer treated as separate discoveries or as isolated relics with different histories. They begin to draw together into a single idea, a set, a pattern, a design said to extend across different places and different hands. And within that story, a number begins to settle. 13. Not as something found with the objects themselves, but as part of a later legend that gathers around them. And once it takes hold, the meaning changes. The skulls are no longer important only because of where they came from, but because of what they are believed to become together. Each is said to hold part of something. Not the whole, only a portion. Part of a larger understanding. Part of something that does not fully exist in any one of them alone. And because of that, the skulls are imagined not simply as relics, but as pieces of an unfinished design, separated across the world, kept apart across time, and waiting, not simply to be found, but to be reunited. It is there that the legend deepens, because the gathering of all 13 is not treated as symbolic alone, but as significant. A moment in which something hidden is said to become known. The details are never entirely fixed. but the structure remains. That the skulls are incomplete as they are. That something passes between them. And that when all 13 are finally brought together, something long withheld may at last be revealed. And once the skulls are drawn that far from the known past, the boundary shifts again. Because for some, even a lost civilization is no longer distant enough to explain them. The story begins to move beyond forgotten human history towards something older, more remote, and far harder to place within the world we know. And if the gathering of all 13 is believed to awaken something, to reveal what has long been hidden, then the boundary shifts again. Because for some, objects capable of that do not belong to any lost civilization or any human past. It is there that the theory turns towards something extraterrestrial. The ancient astronaut theory. The idea that the skulls were not made by lost civilizations alone, but by non-human intelligence, given to humanity, left behind, only carried into history from somewhere beyond it. And with that, the meaning around them changes again. The skulls are no longer important only because they are said to come from the distant past, but because they are believed to contain something beyond it. Knowledge, memory, a signal, an intelligence. For some, they are not approached as objects to be studied alone, but as things to be engaged with, held, focused on, sat with in silence, as though whatever they contain does not disclose itself at a distance. And it is there that the paranormal reading deepens, because the skulls are said not to affect everyone in the same way. For some, nothing. For others, impressions, sensations, visions, moments of communication, the feeling that the object is not entirely inert, that it responds, not mechanically, not in ways that can be measured clearly, but through encounter, through attention, through contact. In some accounts, the skull is not described as symbolic at all, but as a record, a form of knowledge held in material and waiting for the right conditions to be read. Within that framework, the skulls become more than mysterious objects. They become signs of contact, possible traces for those who believe that something external has touched human history and left an imprint behind. The details are never fixed. Some speak of energy, some of consciousness, some of extraterrestrial origin, some of communication with intelligences not our own. But the pattern remains. The skulls are treated not simply as objects from the past, but as presences, things that do not sit easily within the world around them. And from there, the mythology begins to gather around a single object, one skull placed above the rest, repeated more often, described in greater detail, and carried over time into the center of the story itself.
The skulls of the ancestors keep their presence close at hand. Pillowed upon a skull, the living dreamer meets the spirit of his ancestor in sleep.
The basic rhythms echo elsewhere around the world.
In 1924, attention turns to Lubantun in British Honduras, now Belize. A Maya city in the south of the country, its modern name translated as Place of Fallen Stones, with terraces, platforms, and temple structures emerging from dense growth and broken ground. The site was not unknown. Local Maya communities had long known the ruins were there, and earlier visits by Thomas William Francis Gahn, followed by work from Harvard's Raymond Merwin, have already brought parts of the city into view before Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges arrived. By the time Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges enters the story, Lubantun is already a place of excavation, survey, and speculation. He comes with the qualities that suit the setting perfectly. Explorer, adventurer, writer. A man drawn to remote places, to lost cities, and to the stories that gather around them. In 1924, he accompanies Thomas William Francis Gahn on his return to the site. And beside him, in the version that would later take hold, is his adopted daughter, Anna Mitchell-Hedges. The site sits deep in jungle, with collapsed stone structures spread beneath dense vegetation. Much of the excavation involves clearing growth and exposing sections of the ruins that had remained buried for years, allowing the outline of the city to return piece by piece. It is within that setting that the famous discovery is placed. There, the account narrows to a single moment, a glint in the temple, something catching and refracting the light beneath the fallen stone. Not rough, not like the ruin around it. As more of it is exposed, the shape begins to resolve. The curve of the cranium, the hollow of the eyes. What is said to have emerged was a quartz skull, clear, polished, life-sized, and unlike most of the others, made with a separate lower jaw cut so precisely that it could move. From that point on, the object is tied to more than its form. It carries a place, a date, a landscape, a moment of recovery drawn out of a ruined Maya city. And from that point on, the object is no longer carried by form alone. It carries a setting, a discovery, a history that seems to begin in the ruins themselves. And with that, the crystal skull is no longer just an object of curiosity. It becomes the model for something larger, the story most often repeated, the version against which the others would come to be measured.
Now, the skull was promoted as being carved from a single block of clear quartz and supposedly an artifact of great antiquity. And it was Anna who often claimed, guess what, that it had supernatural powers of healing and it could even help you have psychic visions.
It's one of the few interesting examples of the crystal skull because it's been subjected to high magnification. to see if it was manufactured using modern techniques. Now, I've read some reports that say that it shows signs of Victorian tool marks on it, and I've read some other reports that say there are no tool marks on it at all.
In modern day, we've got cameras and evidence and people, so we don't tend to see those kind of things. What we do see is what some people would regard more as supernatural or magical, but really those things are still sacred to the people who believe them. It's just that they don't belong to a religion, they belong to a more spiritual kind of belief cult or culture. In effect, you want to find a good, credible pathway to people to follow to make it look true.
So it depends who you read and who you believe as to whether or not it's a recent copy or whether the story's true.
But the Mitchell-Hedges skull does not remain alone. Beyond Lubantun, other crystal skulls enter circulation, not through jungle excavation, but through museums, private ownership, and the trade in antiquities. In London, one enters the British Museum. By 1898, it has already passed through the hands of the French antiquities dealer Eugene Boban, and later Tiffany, before reaching the collection. In Paris, another follows a different route. Smaller, less imposing at first glance. And with each sample, the frame begins to widen. The crystal skull is no longer tied only to one ruined city, one explorer, or one account of discovery. It begins to move through the modern world in other ways. Bought, collected, displayed, passed between hands, presented as ancient or unusual or significant, with different histories attached to it each time. The route keeps changing. The form does not. A human skull in crystal. Returning again and again, but never by exactly the same path. By the time another major skull reaches the Smithsonian in 1992, arriving anonymously through the mail, the question is no longer only whether one skull was found at Lubantun. It is why the same form keeps returning in London, in Paris, and eventually in Washington, each time with a different account attached to it. And as those accounts accumulate, the more difficult they become to reconcile without contradiction. For a time, the Mitchell-Hedges account holds. A named site, a named year, a named witness, a discovery fixed to a particular place and moment. And that is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Because once the account is set against the record, the first tensions appear. Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges wrote about Lubantun, but in those earlier writings, the skull is absent. It does not appear at the moment it should. It enters the story later. Anna Mitchell-Hedges would later describe the discovery in vivid terms, but the account does not remain fixed. The timing shifts. The details do not hold in quite the same way. And beyond the retelling itself, there is the question of documentation. Others present at the excavation left no record of the skull being found there, nor did anyone record Anna's presence at the dig. Then the chronology begins to separate from the discovery story. By 1936, the skull is documented in London in the hands of the dealer Sidney Burney. By then, whatever its earlier history may have been, it is no longer fixed to Lubatun. It is in circulation. And then comes the detail that alters the account more sharply than any other. In October 1943, Frederick Mitchell-Hedges purchases the skull at Sotheby's. In December of that same year, he confirms it in writing to his brother and says so directly. That is where the later version becomes difficult to hold. Because if the skull was purchased in 1943, then it cannot simply be the same object carried continuously from the ruins at Lubantun into Mitchell-Hedges' hands. The dates do not explain everything, but they do narrow what the account can bear. The skull remains. The story remains. But they no longer hold together as cleanly as before. And once the distance opens, the question changes with it. No longer only where the skull was found, but how it entered the world in the first place. If the skulls did not enter the world through the stories later told around them, then at least some of them entered another way. Through dealers, through collections, through museums. And it is there that Eugene Bauban begins to matter. A French antiquarian working first in Mexico and later in Paris, he appears at the point where some of the best-known skulls begin to move into European hands. The British Museum skull passes through him. By the time it reaches the museum in 1898, it has already moved through Bauban and then Tiffany. In Paris, another major skull enters the French museum world by way of Bauban as well. That does not prove Bauban made the skulls. It does not prove he commissioned them. But it places him close to the point at which more than one of the most famous skulls enters the same commercial network. And that matters. Because once Bauban is linked, not to one skull, but to more than one, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. The skulls begin to look less like separate discoveries, and more like objects moving through the same late 19th century world of dealers, collectors, and museum acquisition. And still, Bauban is not the beginning. Before him, the trail becomes harder to follow. The skulls are less securely held, less clearly placed. Whatever history they had before entering his world is harder to recover. And that gap leaves room for both readings. For skepticism, that the story may have grown as the object moved. For belief, that whatever came before has simply been lost. That is what keeps the field open. Because once some skulls can be followed through dealers, sale rooms, and collections, their differences begin to matter more sharply. Not every route is the same. Not every history aligns. And the more closely those paths are compared, the harder it becomes to treat all of the skulls as though they emerged from the same kind of past. The market explains how some of them traveled, how they were handled, how they were sold, how they entered collections. But it does not entirely explain where they began. And that is where the subject refuses to close. Not in certainty, but in the space between circulation, missing provenance, and the possibility that the story begins earlier than the record can follow. The skulls are no longer being compared by story, but by surface. The British Museum skull, the Paris skull, both had already passed into circulation through Eugene Boban's world, and later, under examination, both begin to point in the same direction. In London, the British Museum skull is studied closely. It is rock crystal, about 25 centimeters high, roughly 4.5 kilograms in weight. Even the incised lines of the teeth begin to matter, with some appearing more consistent with a jeweler's wheel than with older carving techniques. The crystal itself may not even point back to Mexico, but possibly to Brazil. In Paris, the findings move the same way. Not pre-Columbian, not securely fixed inside the ancient world. Later study suggests polishing and abrasion from modern tools, with work carried out far more recently than the mythology around it would imply. At the Smithsonian, the pattern does not break. Under magnification, modern stone carving marks are identical there as well. Taken together, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. More than one famous skull, more than one collection, and the same claim of ancient origin beginning to weaken. And yet, the matter does not close completely. Not because the Mitchell-Hedges story still holds, it does not, but because the object itself never passed as fully into later scrutiny as some of the others. Earlier examination established that it was carved from a single crystal of quartz, but it did not determine its date of manufacture. Anna Mitchell-Hedges later refused further scientific examination. That left one narrower space open, not around the provenance, but around the object itself. And that is where the question changes again. If the stories collapse, and even the strongest examinations point away from antiquity, why do these objects still keep their hold on people? That is where the divide sharpens, because once the stories weaken, what remains is the object itself. For a skeptic, that may be enough. A human skull is already one of the most charged forms we recognize. It carries death, memory, fear, survival. Cut that shape in crystal and it becomes stranger still, clear, cold, precise, almost too deliberate to feel ordinary. In that view, the pull of the skull does not come from hidden origins. It comes from form, symbolism, and the mythology people built around it. For a believer, that is not enough, because even after the provenance weakens, the object does not feel empty.
I think that quartz has also got a kind of symbolic quality. It's long been associated with purity, unsurprisingly with clarity, and also with some kind of spiritual energy in many cultures. And so in modern interpretations, especially with the whole kind of New Age movement, it's believed to amplify energy It's even believed to store information. And that feeds into all the myths sort of built up around these skulls.
It has fascinated me, spirituality, and how some people see it can be enhanced using things like crystals. So if you're of the belief that crystals can enhance energy, people love the mystery and like assuming things, and they're imbuing magical, fantastical, phenomenal properties to an object. That is why people like crystal skulls. If you like crystals, you'll love a crystal skull.
There's a thing called Olson's paradox, and it involves planet Earth. They, for many, many years, thought that the core of planet Earth was made of iron, but it doesn't work. If you computer model the planet using iron as its core, nothing functions the way it's supposed to function. So they tried all kinds of different things to solve this paradox by putting different things into the equation to see how it would operate. Till eventually somebody came up with the idea of trying quartz. Why don't we put quartz in and see if that works? So they put quartz in, and lo and behold, they solved Olson's paradox. The planet works if the core of it is made of quartz, which basically means the entire planet is a giant crystal ball flying through space.
The story may fall away, the origin may narrow, and still the skull seems to retain something. Not proof, not certainty, but presence. A sense that the object has not been accounted for completely. That is how believers continue to describe them, as objects capable of healing, psychic effect, energy, or response. Not because the record proves it, but because, for them, the experience survives even after the history begins to fail. And that is why the subject does not end when provenance does. One side sees projection, the other sees persistence, and between those two readings, the skulls keep their hold. By the end, the certainty has changed. The routes through dealers, collections, and museums have come into view. The strongest claims to antiquity no longer hold as easily as they once did. And yet, the skull does not become ordinary. It remains what it has always been: a human skull in crystal. Clear, cold, and difficult to empty of meaning. The story may narrow, the explanation may sharpen, but something in the object remains unsettled. Not proven, not resolved, still capable of drawing belief, fascination, and the sense that more is there than the record can finally contain. And that may be why the crystal skull survives. Not because the mystery remained untouched, but because it never disappeared.